The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third webinar on the Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. This and all subsequent webinars will be available on makara.us. Just click on the Maury Federation heading, it's circled there in white, and you'll find the Secret Teachings link under its own subheading as shown here. Let's start by taking a look at the illustration in the center of page 15. You see it there on your right. Can we get a reader for this section, please?
Sure. Leah, can you read that for us, please?
Hang on just a sec. I've got to go out of full screen mode and collapse my side panel because it was obscuring the text. So here we go. Go ahead.
The problem of diversity from Kosh's Ars Magna Scendi. In the above diagram, Kosha arranges 18 objects in 2 vertical columns and then determines the number of arrangements in which they can be combined. By the same method, Kosha further estimates that 50 objects may be arranged in many numbers here, combinations.
It's a quinzillion, I think
It's incredible to have worked it out. From this, it will be evident that infinite diversity is possible, for the countless parts of the universe may be related to each other in an incalculable number of ways. And through the various combinations of these limitless subdivisions of being, infinite individuality and infinite variety must inevitably result. Thus, it is further evident that life can never become monotonous or exhaust the possibilities of variety.
Thank you. Okay. Though I agree with Kircher's hypothesis on infinite diversity, I'm a bit puzzled by his math. By my calculations, each of the points in this illustration are linked with the 16 points on the opposite side, giving us 512 connections. As shown by the symbols, each pair of opposite points actually represents 1 point, illustrated in this particular way to show all possible connections. So all possible connections, let's see, if there were 50 points per side, it seems to me that all the possible connections would be represented by 100 times 50, which is 5,000, not the astronomically large number shown here. Maybe I'm missing something. I'm sure that one of you is or more is better at math than I am. If you get what he's talking about here, set me straight or verify my findings.
Hold on. Scott is going to set you straight.
Oh, great. That won't be the first time.
Geez, I wouldn't go that far. I'm just thinking in terms of multiplying, it's 50 factorial is maybe the number we're talking about here, which is 50 times 49 times 48 times 47 and so on.
Well, that wouldn't be what's illustrated here.
Yeah, it's...
You know, here, basically what you have, if you look at any one of these points, it connects to each of the points on the opposite side. And since there's 16 here, that means that each of the 16 on the left connects with each of the 16 on the right, and vice versa. So you could say 32 times 16 will give you the total, which is 512. So extending that, you would say each of the 50 on the left connecting to each of the 50 on the right, and vice versa. And vice versa would give you 100 times 50. That's just what's in the chart. Now, you know, if you made this chart like somehow three-dimensional or I don't know what, I mean, I wouldn't know what he's talking about. Like if it's factorial, it might actually come up to a number like this, but why would this illustration be relevant to a factorial demonstration? I don't get that.
Right. Well, combinations in math, there's a formula for that, and it's not as simple. Combinations versus permutations, whether they could repeat or not. And they deal with multiple factorials, the way you put it together.
Okay.
Now, I don't know. I have to work on this to see.
Yeah, I take that at face value. But, just at the basic, WYSIWYG, what you get is what you see. This chart, it doesn't come out. If you put 50 points on the left and right, you wouldn't get, the connections wouldn't add to this astronomical number, or it would be 5,000. But it would just be a denser version of this. But, given what you said about factorials, and, you have to give the benefit of the doubt to Kircher on this, that, he doesn't, he just he makes a leap here. Kircher further estimates that 50 objects may be arranged in X combinations. This might just be a demonstration of some of those combinations. But anyway, it left me in the dust. Okay, thanks, Scott.
Yes, just best guess right off the top.
Yeah, great, thanks. At any rate, in addition to being a mathematically philosophical treatise, Kircher's book, which came out in the 17th century, it's like 16 something, is really beautifully illustrated. Here's the introduction to his section on diversity, and here's the frontispiece and title page. Now, this is when a book was a book, right? I can't help but wonder if this book and others like it weren't part of MPH's, everybody knows what I mean by MPH, right? Manly P. Hall. MPH's inspiration for the lavish design of the secret teaching of all ages. Look at the similarity of design and layout of these two title pages. So many design elements are the same, the logo, just the way it's all laid out. Anyway, I'm sure he was inspired by some of these earlier books. Okay, before we pick up where we left off last month, let's do a quick review of Plato's 3 orders of being, which formed the bedrock of Greek philosophy for 1,000 years and are fundamental tenets of the age's wisdom. As those of you who have been studying the Secret Doctrine with me will recognize. As we read about the philosophers of the 2 millennia following Plato, we'll see that the most profound among them were influenced, at least in part, by these ideas described here, which almost certainly originated with Pythagoras. So could we get a reader for this, please?
I'm going to volunteer to read this. I recognize every single one of these words. Plato's 3 orders of being. 1, the unmoved mover, also the prime mover, that which continually moves, yet itself is unmoved. The power of, I spoke too soon. The power of abidance is inherent.
No. Abidance. It's like to abide.
Oh, abidance. Okay. The power of abidance is inherent. It is the divine permanence upon which all things are established. Nobler even than self-motion, the first of all dignities. 2, the self-moved, that in which motion is inherent, cannot be separated from its motive power, incapable of dissolution, the nature of the immortals. And 3, that which is moved, that which has motion imparted to it from another, can be separated from the source of its animating principle. It's subject to dissolution and the nature of mortal beings.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, any thoughts or questions about this list? to gain any insight into these three orders of being, we really have to think about the nature of motion. I mean, you know, you can get a kind of false sense of understanding this by just using logic. Oh, you know, there's three orders here, right? You've got the unmoved mover, the self-moved, and that which is moved. That makes sense. But that doesn't really reveal what he's talking about, does it? So in order to make any sense of this, we really have to look at what is meant by motion. Okay, over the course of the proem of the Secret Doctrine, HBB gives the following synonyms for motion. Note that the last 8 have to do with thought or mind. Could we get a reader for this list? In this case, and I can tell you that's Chaitanya. They're down in the middle there.
Please go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Absolute abstract motion, the great breath, eternal ceaseless motion, an arcane living or moving fire, absolute unconditioned consciousness, the universal world soul, Chit, Chaitanya, Mahat, Mahabuddhi, pre-cosmic ideation, universal mind, pure noumenon of thought, immutable divine thought.
Thanks, Scott. So,
by the way, if I can cut back to factorial, the factorial situation is very big because the way you do combinations, in this case, you'd have 48 factorial times 25 factorial. And there are, I don't know how many zeros, there's something like 20 or 30 zeros just in 25 factorial. They're huge numbers. It's 48 factorial times 25 factorial is what you do for 50. So.
Well, it sounds like, you know, that's what he's done here. You know, he's gone factorial on us.
And big time.
Yeah, big time factorial. So, you know, you can't even get there. You know, you start thousands, millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions, quintillions, sextillions, septillions, octillions. You know, it becomes ridiculous. And I'm not even on the top line yet, you know. So it's they say 30 factorial has 28 zeros, and we're talking 25 factorial times 48 factorial. Yeah, so it's probably this. That's probably the way it went. What I can't do with that is reconcile it to this chart in any way. It's a really interesting and quite beautiful graphic description of how to combine basically 16 points with each other.
Right.
You know, but that's it. You know, that
I agree.
Factorial land, so if we would, let me ask you something, Scott. If we made this a 3D chart and say, for instance, those points on the left and on the right were stacked backwards, and say this was 50. No, we'll just keep it at 16. If it was stacked backwards 16-fold on either side, and then all connections were made between all those points, would that be an illustration of a factorial number? You think about that.
Yeah, I'll think about that.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, because, you know, at this point, I get no connection between the two, and yet you're not going to just discount Kircher. He certainly didn't make this basic mistake, you know, I mean, certainly not. You know, that he didn't know how many combinations were represented by this chart. I mean, there's just no way. I just can't accept that, you know. I've read some of the rest of the book, which, by the way, is available there's a beautiful, photographs of each page of this book, so you can read it in its original. I think it's in Wikipedia, but anyway. And so I think he knew what he was talking about, but he didn't give us a pathway between this illustration and this number. Anyway, back to self-moved. So these are all the different possible ways of understanding this concept of motion, right? It is anything but, moving from point A to point B, which is how we think of motion. That's like the one thing that is not described here. And so, you definitely have to go into an abstract understanding in order to get any sense of this. Okay, so stated in a way that uses mind in the place of motion, giving our list here, the bottom 8 of these. We got 4 Sanskrit, and then we have 4 English descriptions of mind, right? I think among them, pure noumenon of thought is quite descriptive. We can just, go with that. And that it is of a divine nature, which of course puts it in the first aspect. So given that, stated in a way that uses mind in the place of motion, the first order of being, at the top there, which he describes as that which continually moves others, yet itself is unmoved. I added others because that's what he's talking about. That becomes the source of mind for others while itself remaining beyond mind, right? It's unmoved. So if mind is movement or that nature of motion, then this unmoved mover is itself beyond mind, which is in keeping with what we've read in the Secret Doctrine. The second tenet becomes that in which mind is inherent. And of course, mind there being divine mind or the noumenon of mind. And the third tenet, which is that which has motion imparted to it from another, becomes that which has mind imparted to it from another. This third group includes the personalities of human beings whose mind is bestowed on them by their souls, which is part of that second group, right? So any thoughts or questions about this? You can see the crossover, the ideas of these 4 men, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, represent the high watermark of not only Greek, but all philosophical thought. Because unlike later European philosophers like Kant and Hegel, Descartes, the ideas of these philosophers came via a master of wisdom from the inner source of the ageless wisdom. We need no further proof of the statement I just made than this statement by Iamblichus, who was Kuthumi, we're told. Can we get a reader just for this short quote?
Sure. Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
No one will deny that the soul of Pythagoras was sent to mankind from Apollo's domain, having either been one of his attendants or more intimate associates, which may be inferred both from his birth and his versatile wisdom.
Yeah, it makes you wonder who Apollo was, or is. Are we talking about Sanat Kumara here? Very possibly, one of his attendants or intimate associates. Very provocative stuff, especially considering that the source is Kuthumi, who's in line to be the next Christ. Okay, let's continue where we left off last month. Unless any of you have any further thoughts or ideas about how we can develop this provocative list. you're going to see it crop up over and over as we go down through the philosophers over the next couple of thousand years, right? You'll recognize this. Okay.
Gary
So,
asked you a question, and I think it's referring to the image we've been talking about. He says, "Have they stolen the Indira's net?"
I have no idea what that means. The Indira's net? It is a kind of net, but I'm not sure what the Indira. Spell that for me.
Indiras.
Oh, Indira.
Gary,
Indira's
you're
Indira net. Yeah, Gary, what's that? Maybe you could tell me about the
I
Indira.
unmuted you, but you're
Indira's
still
net.
self-muted. You're self-muted. You need to. There you go.
Okay. Are we in the house? Well, I've come across the concept of Indira's net in the past, where each soul on Earth
is interconnected.
is represented by a point of light at a cross section of Indira's net.
I see. That's really interesting. You know, the idea of a net was a big part of the ancient philosophy. I don't know about Indira, but Athena's net was that by which personalities were rescued from the deep. So you will see Athena reaching over and from her boat and pulling up a human being with her net. And I'm wondering if it's not the same idea, you know, transported over from India. Of course, the idea being Athena was, you know, sprung from the mind of Zeus. So we're talking about the higher mental plane, which is where the soul exists. So I wonder if that's not it. I'm going to look that up. I'm really, that's really interesting. Indira's net. Yeah, Indira. I don't know my Hindu mythology well enough to know much about Indira, but thanks for that, Gary.
No worries.
And Nicholas says that Iamblichus was Hilarion.
Oh, he was not. Okay, he was Hilarion, not Kutumi. Thanks for that correction. I appreciate that, Nicholas. Still a master, just on a different ray line. Fifth ray now. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that was Hilarion's take on Pythagoras. Most interesting. You know, that actually makes more sense, doesn't it, when you consider the mathematical connection with Pythagoras. Thanks for that. Okay, can we get a reader for this short paragraph, which basically ends the section on Plato?
Oops. Gary, can you read that for us? You're self-muted again. There you go.
Just the highlighted part, yeah?
That's correct. Always.
Sorry, I need to scroll around my screen here. The Platonic discipline was founded upon the theory that learning is really reminiscence, or the bringing into objectivity of knowledge formerly acquired by the soul in the previous state of existence. At the entrance of the Platonic school, in the academy were written the words, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here."
Thoughts or questions about this? First sentence is provocative, and if accepted, goes a long way towards explaining so-called natural talent, right? Given Plato's hypothesis, which is supported by modern theosophy, being gifted simply means that a particular talent was developed in a previous life. And even without any direct recall of that life, a person's development, stored in the causal body, mental unit, and lower permanent atoms, progressively and cyclically demonstrates in each incarnation. So from that perspective, you can see that learning is a form of reminiscence. Okay, the statement, let none ignorant of geometry enter here, suggests a couple of possibilities. First, most obviously, within the academy, higher math was studied and practiced, thus requiring geometry as a prerequisite. That's like, you know, when you go to college, you have to have done arithmetic before you could do algebra. But it was also possible that the mental discipline necessary for the understanding of geometry was considered prerequisite for the understanding of other disciplines, including philosophical thinking. In other words, it's really hinted at, especially in Pythagoras, that the development of philosophical thought definitely took place along mathematical lines. Now, it's my opinion that this has largely been lost, the connection between the two. But you could, make a case for the idea that that's why geometry was required in order to be a part of Plato's school. Any thoughts about that, anybody? Okay, let's take a look at the next sort of informational paragraph. Can we get a reader for this? You could keep reading, Gary. That was a short one. Why don't you have it go with this one too?
Okay. After the death of Plato, his disciples separated into two groups. One, the academics, continued to meet in the academy where once he had presided. The other, the peripatetics, removed to the Lyceum under the leadership of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. Plato recognized Aristotle as his greatest disciple, and according to Peloponnesus, referred to him as the mind of the school. If Aristotle were absent from the lectures, Plato would say, the intellect is not here.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary. So, there's quite an endorsement of Aristotle, that Plato considered him the mind of the school. You just really wonder as to, the stage of initiation of these great philosophers. So let's turn the page and read about Aristotle. Can we get a reader for this paragraph, please?
Lynn, can you read that for us, please?
Yes. Of the prodigious genius of Aristotle, Thomas Taylor writes in his introduction to the Metaphysics, when we consider that he was not only well acquainted with every science, as his works abundantly evince, but that he wrote on almost every subject which is comprehended in the circle of human knowledge, and this with matchless accuracy and skill. We know not which to admire most, the penetration or extent of his mind. Of the philosophy of Aristotle, the same author says, the end of Aristotle's moral philosophy is perfection through the virtues, and the end of his contemplative philosophy, a union with one principle of all things.
Thanks, Lynn. We see in this last statement a continuation of the beliefs of Aristotle's lineage, the Socratic perfection through virtue, which was Socrates' main focus, developing virtue, and the Platonic union with the one principle, the three stages of being that we just described. So let's go on.
Okay, you have a hand up. Hold on.
Okay, good.
Go ahead. Go ahead, please, Martha.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just wanted to add a little gossip that Thomas Aquinas picked up Aristotle's philosophy as a way of getting to Plato, and he was silenced by the church when he produced his Summa Theologica because of the awareness of the grounding of revelation in the human lineage, which was not Thomas Aquinas' intent, but that it's interesting to go back to some of these things to notice also that they worked a lot numerically, Plato's threefold philosophy and all of that. And I was going to suggest that by the time we get down to Kant and Hegel and all these people, the fact is that the fracturing had been so extreme that ethics was considered sort of a self-standing discipline, which was considered one of the greatest heresies of the church. If ethics was separated from theology, from God, then the whole system of the church, the philosophy of the church, would collapse. So I'm intrigued by the value of tracking the lineage of ageless wisdom. I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah, it's so necessary to, get back beyond the influence of the church. Basically, at the, the 4th, 5th century, the grip of the church started getting stronger, and you find there's this, the Dark Ages, it really was a philosophic Dark Ages. Now, there were a few lights that popped up, but even way forward in the 16th, 17th centuries, with Spinoza, who reintroduced philosophic ethics, he wrote the book Ethics. Fortunately, he was in Holland, and so they were a little more liberated there. But he was still excommunicated from the synagogue, as well as all his books were banned by the church. And if he'd been in Spain or France, anywhere else, he would have probably been burned at the stake, because they were still doing that, even that late. So, we're looking at 1,000 years. And Thomas Aquinas was right in the middle of that period, 11th, 12th century, where if they really had to brave, and it was quite dangerous to be a philosopher, as opposed to just an inline church father. So thanks for pointing that out, Martha. A lot of what I just said will be repeated as we go on into the webinar, but maybe not today. We'll see if we get there. So yeah, it's good insights on that. This, in a sense, informed all the illuminated, what we're reading now. These 4 great philosophers informed all of what this lineage informed all the Illumined philosophers all the way through, European times that came later. Anyway,
Francis?
Yeah.
Yvonne asks, was Aristotle one of the earlier lives of one of the masters?
I would say almost certainly, but I don't have specific information. Nicholas, do you know? If you do, you might write a text as on. Did I hear a voice? Yeah, I hear you.
I hear you.
Oh, no, it's me.
Okay.
I'm getting my own echo now. Who was on?
I don't know. We couldn't hear you if you answered, Nicholas. So I'm going to mute you again if you can type.
Yeah, if you know anything about it, if you know about Aristotle's past, that'd be really choice information. Also Plato and Pythagoras, any of the Greek greats, if you have some information, that'd be great. Anyway, let's go on until then. Okay, let me find my place. So we see in this last statement a continuation of the beliefs of Aristotle's lineage, which I've read this, the Socratic perfection through virtue and the Platonic union with the one principle. So if we could have a reader for this next paragraph.
Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
Okay. Aristotle conceived philosophy to be twofold, practical and theoretical. Practical philosophy embraces ethics and politics. Theoretical philosophy, physics and logic. Metaphysics he considered to be the science concerning that substance which has the principle of motion and rest inherent to itself. To Aristotle, the soul is that by which man first lives, feels, and understands. Hence, to the soul, he assigned three faculties: nutritive, sensitive, and intellective. He further considered the soul to be twofold, rational and irrational, and in some particulars elevated the sense perceptions above the mind. Aristotle defined wisdom as the science of first causes. The four major divisions of his philosophy are dialectics, physics, ethics, and metaphysics.
Thanks, Carrie. So, thoughts or questions on this paragraph? In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle states that the goal of a, quote, good human, what DK might call an aspirant or disciple, is, quote, to exercise well and finely the soul's activities according to reason. Reason, he goes on to say, knows what is good for both oneself and in the treatment of others. Now, you compare that to what DK tells us. The son of mind, the soul, is the product of the thought of the universal mind, the thinking, perceiving, discriminating, analyzing identity or spiritual entity. This aspect of the one life is characterized by pure mind, pure reason, pure love, and pure will. You see the connection between all these sources? Aristotle's reason is a microcosmic reflection of universal mind, which is inherent in the realm of the self-moved or soul realm. We could probably talk about the connection between these four sources for the rest of the webinar. But any thoughts or questions about this interconnectedness? See, if we started with the three orders of being, which cast everything in the language of the mover, right? But when we look at HPB's thought, we find that the mover is, in fact, also can be considered in terms of pure noumenon of thought, right? That which initiates thought, or that dynamic energy which becomes the realm of mind and thought, right? And intrinsic to thought on its higher levels, like Buddhic plane, is reason. It's an aspect of intuition and of the Buddhic realm. And so when, given all that, it really gives Aristotle's statement a lot more import, right? It's to exercise well and finely the soul's activities according to reason, right? It's really aligning oneself with the self-moved, which is, the nature of the immortals, which is universal mind. Any thoughts about this? Okay. Let's take a closer look at some of the of Aristotle's ideas as described by MPH. It's easy to see how politics is a further extension of both personal and group ethics. Actually, it's in this day and age, it's quite hard to see. But if you think of politics as ideally administered, it becomes an outer extension of the reason-driven personal and group ethics, right? Aristotelian physics was an attempt to describe how the natural world works, and it included a lot of subjects that we don't normally associate with physics, like the philosophy of mind, sensory experience, memory, anatomy, and even biology. Some of the key concepts of Aristotelian physics include the structuring of the universe into concentric spheres. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this chart, with the Earth at the center and celestial spheres around it. Now, this is, you know, it sort of provokes the derision of modern scientists. You know, as soon as we became heliocentric, we cast aspersions on this idea, but this was never intended to be a literal map, but rather a map of the influences of these various heavenly bodies on our own psyches, right? It's a subjective map, not a physical map. A lot of people don't get that. So this terrestrial spheres were made of 4 elements, namely earth, air, fire, and water, subject to change and decay. The celestial spheres were made of a 5th element, an unchangeable ether. Objects made of these elements have natural motions. Those of earth and water tend to fall, those of air and fire to rise, as indicated by the direction of the triangles in the alchemical systems symbols in the charts on the left. In the next sentence, metaphysics he considered to be the science concerning that substance which has the principle of motion and rest inherent to itself. We find a reference to Plato's 3 orders of being in this. He carried that thinking forward, followed by 2 statements on the nature of soul. First, that the soul is, quote, that by which man first lives, feels, and understands, which is possible as a result of its, quote, nutritive, sensitive, and intellective faculties. This speaks to what DK calls the first acquiescence of the soul, when it agrees to overshadow the new personality after its individualization, thereby nutritively bestowing sensitivity and intellect over the ensuing millennia. So any thoughts or questions about this paragraph before we go on? He also says here that the soul is twofold, rational and irrational. That's interesting when we think of the idea of irrational numbers or irrational concepts. What's the functions? Which, you know, like pi and phi, which have that quality of rational. So rational being intellective and irrational being higher mind. Yeah, I see a hand up. Who's that?
Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, it's me again. Don't want to throw a monkey wrench into this, but I recall reading in Blavatsky, HPB, said that Aristotle was not an initiate.
Oh, is that right?
And furthermore, I looked up that article I think I sent to you before called Plato and Platonism that she wrote, and in it she says, quote, but Aristotle was no trustworthy witness. He misrepresented Plato, and he almost caricatured the doctrines of Pythagoras. Ouch.
Oh my, ouch, indeed. Yeah.
So
well,
there seems to be, I don't know. That's what I recall from the old lady.
Yeah, good. Well, there's some indication of that in, I think it's the paragraph coming, in the difference between their, you know, the deductive and inductive reasoning. Yeah, it is in the coming paragraph. And he basically adopts the scientific, what is now considered the scientific method in his type of reasoning. And that's, in a basic break from Plato on that. So that's the only indication in MPH of that. But that's very interesting. It's hard to think, though, that, that Plato, when he says the mind, the intellect is not present, in the school, that he wasn't even an initiate or a low initiate, but who knows?
Yeah, I don't. My recollection.
Francis.
Yeah, well, hi. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Francis. I'm sorry I had, anyway. But, I think it's a Ray issue.
Yeah.
It's very clear that Plato, and it was stated, and also Pythagoras were on the second ray in their soul. Not so for Aristotle. And the third ray was definitely, which leads into a much more reasoning rather than intuitive type of approach.
Yeah,
and when it came to Leibniz, it was the same thing. Blavatsky said almost an initiate. That kind of thing with his monadology and how he was looking at the monad and so forth. Her understanding of the, she's a master now, whatever. But she doesn't give the third rate types the same kind of authority as the second rate types, and so he was a great man, Aristotle, and he's very responsible in certain ways for Western science, and Western thought. Not Neoplatonism, that's DK and others coming back, but Western thought. We just have to be grateful that Alexander the Great didn't quite succeed in killing him, because Alexander was his student, and obstreperous Ray 1 type, and just about did him in one fine day. So we have to be grateful. And does she mean third degree initiate? What does she mean? I don't know, but I'm interested, and I've contrasted the two of those great thinkers, and let's just say that Aristotle covers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and with tremendous devotion to his teacher Plato. So anyway, just a thought about the rays and how Blavatsky sees the initiate.
Yeah. While I have you on the line here, Michael. Can you make any connection between figures that we're aware of through theosophy and these ancient Greeks, like are you aware of Joao being any of these?
Yeah, well, a little bit, but a lot of it's got to be hearsay. And Joao was supposedly, he was called the Just Greek, and his name was Cleinias, and he was Cleinias with a K, and he was second in command at the Pythagorean Academy with Pythagoras. So that's one. When it comes to Plato, obviously even an initiate at that time, and certainly just obviously a master at this time, and probably not Pythagoras, although they had certain things in common, connected with music and so forth. But let's just say, Plato had the definite third ray, along with the second, and not so Pythagoras, as far as I can understand. And then there's the mystery man Socrates. I just don't know. I mean, there is a combination. Very brave man. There's a combination of the third ray, very, very strong in him. Of course, that whole thing about ancient Greece with a strong third ray. Even today, that third ray hangs on. Now, when it comes to Neoplatonists, you do get a little bit of a. Iamblichus was supposedly Paul of Tarsus, Saint Paul. Iamblichus, the great theurgist. So that's a continuation of that work. And DK was maybe Plotinus, who was the foremost teacher of that Neoplatonist school. As I say, we have no way yet to confirm these things, and I just wish I knew who was Socrates, really. Obviously he existed. He was a real individual, and he wasn't Plato. Plato wrote later after his death. But we'll find out. We'll find out.
If not on this side, on the other side, right?
Yes, and then we'll forget it when we come back, how it goes.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
I really appreciate that you're going over this, Francis. It's so good. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's so provocative. And you'll see that as we get into Neo, there was a Neo-Pythagoreanism as well. That's where Tiana of Apollonius of Tiana came forth. And then there was the Neoplatonism, which had a bunch of heavy hitters. And we'll get to those great stuff coming up.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And you have another hand.
Yeah.
Martha, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add an antidote. There's an apocryphal tale about Aristotle that he was asked if women were inferior to men, and he said, "Oh yes, I can verify that because they have fewer teeth in their mouth." And so his wife must have had a problem with her teeth. However, not to dismiss him, it was more that what we were learning in theology was that Aristotle actually probably gave room for modern science. I think Michael was alluding to that, of a more empirical nature, and I can he was the master of logic and took Plato's ethics an interesting new direction from where Plato started, but in so doing, he may have put a crack in the philosophical grasp of what we would consider the spiritual or the intuitive direct knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Aristotle didn't have a lot of tolerance for that approach. It was not about the distinction between him and Plato, as I understand it, was not anywhere about power or egotism, but much more about process, as Michael said, probably the phase differences.
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, if you look at the difference between, the second and third ray, you have it right there in Plato and Aristotle. The third ray to sharpen and inspire the intellect is one of the purposes of third ray. Whereas the second is much more to a magnetic radiatory environmental space that you can then bring the inspiration down into, and so if you're a master, which I suspect Plato was, what Aristotle was covering through mind would just be instantly available through the intuition. So it could be that it was really with Plato that we had the last of that first dispensation, the last example of the first dispensation of the great Greek philosophers, which then was interestingly revisited in Neoplatonism. You know, as Michael suggested, maybe even the same folks came back. You know, which would be really interesting. You know, that Platonism would be the same characters as Neoplatonism. That would be something. But, you know, why not? It's very possible.
Francis, I have a tiny little antidote. Or no, it's anecdote. I don't know if it's the antidote to anything. I've got 3 kids. One is a second-ray soul, one's a third-ray soul, and one's a seventh-ray soul. So I've got this microcosm of how people receive the teaching. Now my daughter, second-ray soul like myself, no problem, immediate adaptation and immediate acquiescence to the...
We lost you, Michael. Hello? Can somebody else speak, please?
Michael, we did lose you, Michael.
Oh.
Now we got you.
Am I back?
Yes.
Am I back now? I'm so sorry.
That's
anyway,
right.
three children, a seventh-ray soul, a second-ray soul, and a third-ray soul. So I get a workout, okay? Yeah. And as I try to present the teaching, and I'll be quick about it here. My daughter Heidi, she sees it as I do, second-ray soul, no problem, and we believe. All right. My son Brennan, the occultist of ancient time with the seventh ray, it's got to be on the practical, magical occult path, and he accepts these things. Now the point. My youngest son Matthew, teaching philosophy on the third ray. He teaches the philosophy of religion, or has, and he doesn't believe. He does not accept. To him, it's all interesting hypothesis, and it has to be proven with the intellect in order to be even remotely acceptable. And you know, I say, well, look, Matt, this is just obvious. Just use your intuition. But no, he's got a sharp mind, the acute ray of divine mental perception, and that's the way he's going to prove it to himself, or not at all. So I got to work out, and I have to adapt. Different methods, different methods. Yeah. The third ray does not accept this kind of thing unless it can really be, well, in general, unless it can be really verified by kinds of proofs which are solid. That's my experience.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
It reminds me of Joseph Campbell when asked what his practice was, and he replied, underlining.
Oh, that's good. That's so good.
It really leads you to thinking he was third rate, doesn't it? And of course, he was a teacher of philosophy, basically, and mythology. So there you have that equivalence to your youngest, Matthew.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I started out with the secret doctrine, I underlined everything and understood nothing. But now I think it's improved a little bit. Anyway, I've said enough. Thank you.
Yeah. Does that sound familiar, Scott? Okay. You know, we read most of Bailey and underlined it in place of understanding it. At least I'll speak for myself. That is to say, I would underline what I particularly didn't understand.
Yeah, we did a lot of that for Bailey and Blavatsky.
Yeah. Let's go on to the next little section on this. Can we get a reader for this? This is still talking about Aristotle.
Scott, can you read that for us?
It's like kind of a key part.
Did we lose you, Scott? Did you guys lose me?
Oh, are you talking to me? I missed that.
Yes, please. I asked if you could read that for us.
I'm sorry, I missed that. God is defined as the first mover, the best of beings, an immovable substance, separate from sensible things, void of corporeal quantity, without parts, and indivisible. Platonism is based upon a priori reasoning, Aristotelianism upon a posteriori reasoning. Aristotle taught his pupil Alexander the Great to feel that if he had not done a good deed, he had not reigned that day.
Scott, any thoughts or questions about this? Aristotle's first mover derives directly from Plato's unmoved mover, right? I mean, you would have to read a lot to catch the distinction, if there is one. And this continues the tradition of the highest level of Greek thought on deity. But what really separates Aristotle from Plato is the difference between a priori or a priori and a posteriori reasoning. A priori proceeds from theoretical deduction, from the causal to the finite, as above, so below. Plato, HPB, and DK all use this method. A posteriori reasoning builds its philosophy from observation and experience. Aristotle and the modern scientific world employ this method, the latter dismissing a priori philosophy as unprovable speculation. Okay. And as Michael pointed out, we have a real second, third ray shift here. You know, a priori being much more palatable to second ray types, a posteriori much more to third ray types. So, though Aristotle believed in a first mover, over the millennia, his approach has contributed to guiding science away from consideration of the unseen realms. And you'll see this in scores of philosophers that succeeded. You know, the Greeks, many of them embraced the Aristotelian method of a posteriori reasoning. So let's...
Francis, you have a hand up.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Please go ahead, Julie. You're self-muted. Julie, go ahead. You're self-muted. Okay, we can't hear you, and you still show up as being self-muted. You need to click your little microphone, and it should unmute you from your end.
In your little control panel, you'll see a mic with a red slash through it. Just click it once, and it'll turn green. Then you can speak. Okay.
There we go. There we go. Got it.
Oh, there you go. Good.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to say thank you to Michael for explaining that about his family, because we are dealing with, in the microcosm, we are dealing with our own personalities plus our families.
Yes, indeed. It's so useful to be aware of the ray types and ray energies when interacting with, anyone else, in your household or elsewise, that there are 7 truths, always being forwarded, not one.
Yes, I find some of it very difficult to understand because I'm an actual energy healer. So I'm working with people's energies, and even though I'm trying trying hard to understand the Bailey text, some of it seems incredibly like reading Noddy, and some of it is incredibly difficult. But still, I have a lot to learn.
Well, yes, we all do. 4 decades later, I still have a lot to learn. I think Michael would probably say the same thing.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful that I'm listening to you, very clever people.
Well,
Thank you.
You're very welcome to be here, and I appreciate your participation. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
So, anyone else before we move on? We're going to just quickly jump over to the allegorical illustration that you see on the left there on page 16. See if you can find the allegorical symbols that are being described in the text as this is read aloud. Can we get a reader for this, please?
Yes, I'm going to ask Michael if you can read that for us, please.
Oh, that's good. That should.
Michael, there you go.
Which Michael? This Michael?
You,
Okay.
yes, that Michael.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I'll do my best. Virgil describes part of the ritual of a Greek mystery, possibly the Eleusinian, in his account of the descent of Aeneas to the gate of hell under the guidance of Sibyl. Of that part of the ritual portrayed above, the immortal poet writes, "Full in the midst of this infernal road, an elm displays her dusky arms abroad. The god of sleep there hides his heavy head, and empty dreams on every leaf are spread. Of various forms, unnumbered specters more, centaurs and double shapes besiege the door. Before the passage, horrid Hydra stands, and Briareus with all his 100 hands. Gorgon's Geryon with his triple flame, and vain Chimera vomits empty flame. The chief unsheathed his shining steel, prepared, though seized with sudden fear, to force the guard. Offering his brandished weapon at their face, had not the Sibyl stopped his eager pace, and told him what those empty phantoms were, forms without bodies and impassive air."
Thanks, Michael. No one reads poetry like you. That's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, here's a detail with the Hydra, the Chimera, the Sibyl at far right, and Aeneas with his shield. And you can see the relevant part of the poem there on the right. Okay, we're going to skip the sections on the skeptics, Stoics, Epicureans, and Eclectics, all of which are more or less exoteric philosophies, and move on to 1st century AD Neo-Pythagoreanism. If we could get a reader for this paragraph, please.
Karen, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. I'll try. The Neo-Pythagorean school flourished in Alexandria during the 1st century of the Christian era. Only 2 names stand out in connection with it: Apollonius of Tyana and Moderatus of Gades. Neo-Pythagoreanism is a link between the older pagan philosophies and Neoplatonism. Like the former, it contained many exact elements of thought derived from Pythagoras and Plato. Like the latter, it emphasized metaphysical speculation and ascetic habits. A striking similarity has been observed by several authors between Neo-Pythagoreanism and the doctrines of the Essenes. Special emphasis was laid upon the mystery of numbers, and it is possible that the Neo-Pythagoreans had a far wider knowledge of the true teachings of Pythagoras than is available today. Even in the 1st century, Pythagoras was regarded more as a god than a man, and the rival of his philosophy was resorted to apparently in the hope that his name would stimulate interest in the deeper systems of learning. But Greek philosophy had passed the zenith of its splendor. The mass of humanity was awakening to the importance of the physical life and physical phenomena. The emphasis upon earthly affairs, which began to assert itself later, reached maturity of expression in the 20th century materialism and commercialism, even though Neoplatonism was to intervene and many centuries passed before this emphasis took definite form.
Thanks, Karen. Any thoughts or questions about this paragraph? A lot of information. It's interesting that this school was based in Alexandria, home of the Great Library, which was destroyed in the 3rd century AD. Actually, it was destroyed successively, went into disrepair, but it was finally destroyed in the 3rd century AD. So did the Neo-Pythagoreans have access to works from possibly from the time of Pythagoras himself, stored in that library? We don't know. But I find it interesting that they were based in Alexandria and that the library was there. Theosophists.
Francis,
Yep.
Scott's got his hand up.
Yep.
Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. I recall DK saying that Apollonius of Tyana was Jesus, is a master. That was his incarnation to become a master.
That's how I understand it too. And in fact, must have snuck into my house and written this next part.
Oh, sorry.
Most alien Blavatsky.
Stealing your thunder. Sorry.
No. It's actually great that the Neo-Pythagorean Apollonius of Tyana was an incarnation of the Master Jesus, like Scott just said. Like Jesus, Apollonius was a miracle worker and renowned teacher at Tyana and Ephesus, which is, I think quite significant. That was a major Greek center. It's, now in Turkey. Following the path set forth by Pythagoras, he was silent for 5 years. There's a fragment of one of Apollonius's writings on sacrifice. That's the name of the writing, on sacrifices, in which he states that God cannot be influenced by prayers or sacrifices. Is that it? No. Let me get back to this. God cannot be influenced by prayers or sacrifices and has no wish to be worshipped by humans, but can be reached by a spiritual procedure involving nous, like the French nous, N-O-U-S, because he himself is pure nous, and nous is the greatest faculty of humankind. Nous can be roughly translated as the intuitive faculty of the soul. It was part of the language of the original Pythagoreans.
Francis, there is this, I just want to make 3 analogies. As Gautama was to the Buddha, so Jesus was to Lord Maitreya, so Apollonius was to Jesus. In other words, everything I've been able to determine shows Apollonius being born before Jesus was put to death. And what I think is the case is that it's one of those tulku phenomena where the master or the becoming master takes over the vehicle of his student, just as Maitreya took over the vehicle of Jesus and the Buddha took over the vehicle of Gautama. I think that may actually be what happened. And, to the observer, it looks like, okay, that's the incarnation of Jesus. But in what way is it the incarnation? And I believe it is the rendering of the vehicle up to the superior teacher. So that is my impression. And I just thought I would share that as a possibility.
Well, when you look at these, the fact that you're talking about 4th and 5th initiates, that it would be no great feat for them to, in a sense, render their vehicle available to the higher master, as Jesus did to the Christ. So, you have a threefold possible descent here, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I read that date disparity too. There's, they're not that positive about Apollonius's dates. So, you can fudge it to you can make it work if you have to, But, I think certainly what you're describing is a distinct possibility. Thank you.
We can ask them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, make sure and come find me, and before you ask them, and bring me there.
Ring along, and we have a question. Okay.
Okay. This passage on Apollonius came from a small book by MPH entitled "The Initiates of Greece and Rome." He did a series of these books. So if we could get a reader for this, please. It's quite interesting.
Vicky, can you read that for us? I've unmuted you, but you're self-muted. Vicky, are you there? You're self-muted.
Click on your little mic icon, Vicky.
Nope, not happening. Okay, let's go to Tia. Can you read that for us? You're self-muted as well. Okay.
No, huh?
Yep, it's not working. Lynn, can you read that for us, please?
Yes. In order to appreciate the mind of Apollonius, we cannot do better than to quote from a letter written by him to the consul Valerius on the event of the loss of his son. There is no death of anyone, but only in appearance, even as there is no birth of any, save only in seeming. The change from being to becoming seems to be birth, and the change from becoming to being seems to be death. But in reality, no one is ever born, nor does one ever die. It is simply a being visible and then invisible, the former through the destiny of matter, and the latter because of the subtlety of being which is ever the same, its only change being motion and rest.
Here we have motion again, interestingly. Yeah, it's pretty clear, isn't it? Sounds very much like firsthand knowledge to me. Thanks, Lynn. So almost everything we know about Apollonius comes to us through a 2-volume biography by the 3rd century AD writer Philostratus, in which he details a trip to the Indian Himalayas, where Apollonius was given 7 rings, one for each planet, which he wore one or more at a time for the rest of his life. The association of the Neo-Pythagoreans with the Essenes is interesting. In Hebrew, the word Essene means to heal. Josephus tells us that their cardinal principles were active benevolence and self-discipline. They had an esoteric school guarded by secrecy, accessible through novitiate and degrees. Josephus described the rule of a community, describing the rule of a community presents the picture of a tranquil life divided between practical avocations, assemblies, and ritual observances. It makes sense that a reincarnation of Jesus would, or a furtherance of the consciousness of Jesus, would find himself in a school that held a similar philosophy to the Essenes, if not the Essene school itself. And there's those who believe that Jesus was an Essene. The Theosophical Glossary also tells us that the Neo-Pythagoreans were a reaction to and in revolt against the degenerate religions and philosophies of the time, which had become almost wholly exoteric and ritualistic. And hence they strove to combine the teachings of speculative mystical philosophy with individual efforts at living a life in keeping with that philosophy. Really was a reintroduction of the ancient teachings. A century later, the resurgence in the Pythagorean doctrine led to a similar resurgence in the philosophy of Plato. So could we get a reader for this paragraph, please?
Frida, can you read that for us? You're self-muted.
Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I can't read it. It's a bit too small for me.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Somebody else can.
Sorry.
That's too bad. You're coming through loud and clear, but I know.
Gary, can you read it? You're self-muted. There you go. Thank you.
Although Ammonius Saccas was long believed to be the founder of Neoplatonism, the school had its true beginning in Plotinus, AD 204-269. Prominent among the Neoplatonists of Alexandria, Syria, Rome, and Athens were Porphyry, Pagandum,
Iamblichus.
Sorry, Porphyry, Lambicus. Yeah, I'm on a phone too, it's a bit difficult. Lambicus, Sallustius, the Emperor Julian, Plutarch, and Proclus. Neoplatonism was the supreme effort of decadent pagandom to publish and thus preserve for posterity its secret or unwritten doctrine. In its teachings, ancient idealism found its most perfect expression. Neoplatonism was concerned almost exclusively with the problems of higher metaphysics. It recognized the existence of a secret and all-important doctrine, which from the time of the earliest civilizations had been concealed within the rituals, symbols, and allegories of religions and philosophies. To the mind unacquainted with its fundamental tenets, Neoplatonism may appear to be a mass of speculations interspersed with extravagant flights of fancy. Such a viewpoint, however, ignores the institutions of the mysteries, those secret schools into whose profundities of idealism nearly all of the first philosophers of antiquity were initiated.
Thank you, Gary. Any thoughts or questions on this paragraph? Because Neoplatonism was something of a last hurrah of the ageless wisdom before modern theosophy, and because all 7 of these men were renowned thinkers, let's take a closer look at their works. Plotinus was the founder of Neoplatonism, and I think, Michael, you said that very possibly a reincarnation of DK, is that correct?
Yes, that is occult rumor has it. Yes.
That's kind of
okay.
So Plotinus was the founder of Neoplatonism, whose tenets are similar to those of theosophy. Not surprisingly then, right? For example, he taught that the soul is composed of a higher and a lower part. The higher part being unchangeable and divine, and providing the lower part with life, while the lower part is the seat of the personality. You know, that's the imprisoned soul that you hear read about, described. So Plotinus, Porphyry, interesting character, whose name means clad in purple. It's because it came from a royal family. Wrote a treatise on Neoplatonism called Aids to the Study of the Intelligibles, but was best known for the work Introduction to Categories, famous especially during the Middle Ages for its philosophical categorization of substance into the 5 components: genus, species, difference, property, and accident. Could we get a reader for this section, please? On Porphyry. This is a quote from Porphyry.
Yes, Brandon, can you read that for us, please? You're self-muted. Oops, you were unmuted for just a minute and then you got muted again. Okay, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go.
All right. I'm on my phone too, but hold on for a second. The soul is bound to the body by a conversion to the corporeal passions, and again liberated by becoming impassive to the body. That which nature binds, nature also dissolves, and that which the soul binds, the soul likewise dissolves. Nature indeed bound the body to the soul, but the soul binds herself to the body. Nature therefore liberates the body from the soul, but the soul liberates herself from the body. Hence there is a twofold death. The one indeed universally known, in which the body is liberated from the soul, but the other peculiar to philosophers, in which the soul is liberated from the body.
Thanks, Brendan. Great to have you with us. Okay. The second liberation. Wait a minute, what did I go to? Yeah. The second liberation, wherein, according to Porphyry, the soul is liberated from the body, describes the final stage at the fourth initiation of what DK calls the second acquiescence of the soul. Could we get a reader for this quote from Esoteric Psychology?
Dana Marie, can you read that for us, please?
Yeah, thank you. The impact of a soul is called forth by the dilemmas and through the emergencies of the later stages of the path of experience. During this stage, the urgency of the need and the dilemmas brought about by the forces of opposition lead the man to submit to a higher influence. He calls then in desperation upon the soul and upon the spiritual resources laid upon in his divine nature and hitherto remaining unused. This impact is called the touch of the acquiescence and marks the acceptance by the soul of the demand of the personality for help and light. The soul acquiescence in the plea of the personality for guidance. Acquiesces.
Thank you. So you can see the relationship to Porphyry's idea of the second death, right? In this. Okay, any thoughts or questions about any of this material? Okay, next up, Iamblichus, which was Paul of Tarsus, who became, tell me again, Michael?
It's Hilarion. I think Nicholas may have mentioned that. Yeah, it's Paul of Tarsus, Hilarion, and Iamblichus. Yes, and then Hilarion again.
Yeah, fifth ray stuff.
Yes, with a very strong first ray behind it monadically, I think. Anyway.
Well, it's wonderful reading. In fact, since you're on, why don't you read this? I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay. The dyad gets its name from passing through or asunder. For the dyad is the first to have separated itself from the monad, whence also it is called daring. For when the monad manifests unification, the dyad steals in and manifests separation. The triad has a special beauty and fairness beyond all numbers, primarily because it is the very first to make actual the potentiality of the monad. Oddness, perfection, proportionality, unification, limit. Yeah, he's given us a whole process there of how things manifest, and very strong, practical numerology. He was a great theurgist. He could summon the gods. He had the power. Yeah. Yeah.
So he was born in Syria. It's interesting, considering the idea that Jesus was a Syrian master. You wonder about the link there. And correct me if I'm wrong, Theosophists believe him to be an incarnation of Kuthumi. Is that correct?
Now, who is that? Iamblichus?
No. Yeah. No. That's
no.
the correction. That's the correction that Nicholas made at the beginning of the session. Yeah. I have that written here. It's not Kuthumi.
Hilarion. Hilarion Paul. Paul Saul, Paul Hilarion Iamblichus. Yes, I think so.
I made that correction. He was the descendant of several priest kings of the Arab royal family of Amisa. There were all kinds of seals of this royal family on the internet. He continued the Neoplatonist lineage, studying under Porphyry, but eventually returning to Syria to found his own school at Apamea near Antioch. You can see the ruins of that, or at least of Apamea. I don't know if particularly that's the school or not, but he was there. And that city was famous for its Neoplatonic philosophers. There he wrote the collection of Pythagorean doctrines, which in 10 books comprised extracts from several ancient philosophers. Only the first 4 books and fragments of the 5th survive. So, since Iamblichus as Hilarion is so important to Theosophists, let's look at a couple of more quotes. You may remember that Alice Bailey was on, oh gosh, that's all irrelevant now. Anyway, if we could get a reader for this this quote, which is really a beautiful description of Plato's unmoved mover.
Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
Before the things that really are, even the first principles of all things, is one divine being, prior even to the first God and King, abiding immovable in the aloneness of his own absolute unity. For neither is intelligence nor any principle else intermingled with him, but he is established an exemplar of the God self-begotten, self-produced, and only begotten, the one truly good. For he is something absolutely great and supreme, the source of all things, and root of the first ideals subsisting in the supreme mind. Then from this one, the God sufficient in himself, caused himself to shine forth, and hence he is self-engendered and self-sufficient. For he is the beginning and God of gods, a unity proceeding from the one, subsisting before essence, and the principle of essence. For from him are being and essence, and he is called accordingly Noetarch, chief of the realm of thought. Iamblichus. Sorry, I was just going to get the...
No, please, go ahead. Iamblichus.
Iamblichus on the mysteries, de mysteries Egyptiorum, the 2 souls of man.
Yeah, there on the left is an original publication. I find this particularly beautiful. You can see the unmoved mover being described here, can't you? That the one that just stands beyond mind, and yet is the sends mind forth in others. The unmoved mover. Yeah, truly beautiful. That center illustration is now inaccurate, by the way. I was pointing out where Master Kuthumi is and all that. Though you could almost certainly find a similar illustration for Hilarion. All you'd have to do is move over to the right a little bit under the Lord of Civilization, and you would find a similar kind of a lineage there. Okay. So the list goes on of these amazing Neoplatonists. Astonishingly, Julian, who was both a Roman emperor and a Neoplatonist, was initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries. You know, we don't get too many heads of state these days. Well, you get my meaning. Which he would later try to restore. At age 20, he renounced Christianity in favor of Neoplatonism. Julian was friends with, actually, let's get a reader for this before I go on. This is his final speech on his deathbed.
Julie, can you read that for us? You're self-muted. There you go. There you go.
Most opportunely, friends, has the time now come for me to leave life, which I rejoice to return to nature at her demand, like an honourable debtor, not, as some might think, bowed down with sorrow, but having learned much from the general conviction of philosophers, how much happier the soul is than the body, and bearing in mind that whenever a better condition is severed from a worse, one should rejoice rather than grieve.
Thank you, Julie. Julie for Julian, very good.
Julianne, my name's Julianne.
Oh, is it? Oh my goodness. Oh, perfect then. Good call, BL. Okay, Julian was friends with the Neoplatonist Sallustius. Now, this is really interesting. He wrote on the gods and the cosmos while serving as Julian's Praetorian prefect of Gaul. Isn't that amazing? Referencing the higher realms, he said, "These things never happened, but always are." Very succinct. Okay, next up, Plutarch. He spent the last 30 years of his life serving as a priest at Delphi. He thus connected part of his literary work with the sanctuary of Apollo. The processes of oracle giving and the personalities who lived or traveled there. One of his most important works is Why Pythia Does Not Give Oracles in Verse. But even more important is the dialogue on the E and Delphi. You see the coin on the right side with the E in the center of it there, which features Ammonius, a Platonic philosopher and teacher of Plutarch, and Lambrius, Plutarch's brother. According to Ammonius, the letter E written on the temple of Apollo in Delphi originated from the following fact. The wise men of antiquity, whose maxims were also written on the walls of the vestibule of the temple, were not 7, but actually 5. Chilon, Solon, Thales, Bias, and Patakos, or Patakos. However, the tyrants Cleobulos and Periandros used their political power in order to be incorporated in the list. Thus, the E, which corresponds to number 5, constituted an acknowledgement that the Delphic maxims actually originated from the 5 true wise men. He wrote, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. To make no mistakes is not in the power of man, but from their errors and mistakes, the wise and good learn wisdom for the future." Finally, we have Proclus, the last of the 7. Interesting that it's 7. He set forth an elaborate and fully developed system of Neoplatonism, which had a profound influence upon Western medieval philosophy. His commentary on the first book of Euclid's Elements is one of the most valuable sources we have for the history of ancient mathematics. Proclus was the last of the great classical philosophers. Can we get a reader for this? You'll see a very different ray type coming forth here.
Anna, can you read that? Okay, I hear a lot of stuff, but I don't hear you.
Let's move on to someone else.
Hi, Antonella. Can you read that for us, please? You're self-muted. There you go.
Sure. Hi. Yeah. It is told that those who first brought out the irrationals from concealment into the open perished in shipwreck to a man. For the unutterable and the formless must needs be concealed. And those who uncover and touch this image of life were instantaneously destroyed and shall remain forever exposed to the play of the eternal waves. Proclus.
Thank you, Antonella. Nice to have you with us.
Thank
you. Yeah, you see this reference to the irrationals. Think back to the description of Aristotle, where he said the soul is divided into irrational and rational parts. And so you get a sense of the importance of this irrational awareness, like pi and phi are considered irrationals, right? So these were, images. It's interesting that he describes them as images of life, right? And those who uncovered and touched this image of life, the irrational aspect of the soul, which has its counterpart in irrational numbers. Because they uncovered this, they were instantly destroyed, in this shipwreck. It's an interesting idea. So, since the text references Proclus, let's jump ahead a page and take a look at the illustration in the middle of page 18. Could we get a reader for this, please?
Karen, can you read that? You're self-muted. Okay, I don't see her coming in, so Leah, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. Before a proper appreciation of the deeper scientific aspects of Greek mythology is possible, it is necessary to organize the Greek pantheon and arrange its gods, goddesses, and various superhuman hierarchies in concatenated order. Proclus, the great Neoplatonist, in his commentaries on the theology of Plato, gives an invaluable key to the sequence of the various deities in relation to the first cause and the inferior powers emanating from themselves. When thus arranged, the divine hierarchies may be likened to the branches of a great tree. The roots of this tree are firmly embedded in unknowable being. The trunk and larger branches of the tree symbolize the superior gods. The twigs and leaves, the innumerable existences dependent upon the first and unchanging power.
Thanks, Leah. So here's some close-ups so you can actually read these leaves. At the bottom of the trunk, we see chaos, which is another name for the Great Mother and is the initiating source of all manifestation. As we move up the tree, we see primordial gods like Uranus and Oceanus. At the top, we see the later gods and goddesses like Vesta, Ceres, and the Muses, right? It would be absolutely fascinating to actually follow each branch of this and see how they are related. I'm assuming there really is logical sense to the way these are arranged. So it'd be really interesting to do that. Of course, we don't have time to do it here. It would take us into a whole study of mythology, probably about 5 webinars worth. So we'll just leave it at this. And speaking of leaving it at this, we're at the end of our time. I really appreciate you being a part of the webinar. I enjoy nothing more than hosting these and having this interaction with you. So thanks for joining, and I hope to see you next time, which I believe, VL, is we're on track for the
3rd of November.
3rd of November, the first Sunday in November. So,
right.
And for those of you who are interested, we're in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be doing the next webinar on the secret doctrine. So I hope to see you there. Until then, thank you all so much for participating.
Okay, and Francis, I just want you to know, you got a question from Gary that says, can the slides be shared via email? Yes, Gary, Francis very generously gives us a PDF version of his slides, and when I send the information out about the recordings being on Makara, the recordings include his slides. So it's going to take me a little while to process that, but yes, they will be there.
A day or two after the webinar, DL has posted them, very often just a day. So just check back, go to Makara, and you know, when this secret teaching of all ages here, let me show you again how to get there. I'll bring it back up, all the way back up to the top. It looks like this.
It's www.makara.us, and then Moira Federation webinars, and then down here you see the secret teaching of all ages.
Yeah, just click on that, and if it says secret teachings of all ages webinar 3, then you'll have those images available. Okay, folks, I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for participating.
Thank you.